The search perimeter was dictated by terrain, weather, and the era's limited navigation and reconnaissance tools, factors that made precise mapping and close-in observation risky and often ineffective. For more than 6 decades, the exact location of the missing aircraft remained unknown, with no usable coordinates to anchor a focused recovery case file. The primary constraint preventing discovery was not a lack of institutional will, but the physical reality of uncharted mountainous jungle that rapidly concealed structural aluminum. Because the lost location could not be pinpointed, no effective search effort was initiated, and the case moved into an administrative status rather than an active recovery operation. The terrain denied practical ground access, and no radio message ever narrowed the last known position into a recoverable point on a map. The missing airframe was a consolidated B-24J Liberator. It carried the military serial number 4273308 and operated under the designated tactical nickname Hot as Hell. On January 25, 1944, the heavy bomber departed Kunming, China, bound for Chabua, India. Though designed as a strategic bomber, this airframe was executing a routine logistical transport flight. The aircraft carried a crew of 8 personnel. Their primary objective was strictly operational, ferrying essential supply loads across one of the most physically hostile aviation environments ever charted. The flight path required navigating the Himalayan mountain corridor, in a treacherous transit zone known operationally to the military as the Hump route. It was a high-altitude cargo air bridge, demanding that unpressurized, heavily loaded aircraft traverse jagged terrain while negotiating localized, violent weather systems. Crews had to maintain strict altitude floors to clear the granite peaks, while constantly calculating engine performance degradation. The operational tolerance for mechanical failure, severe atmospheric interference, or navigational drift was effectively zero. If an aircraft encountered severe headwinds that reduced its ground speed, or if it faced sudden downdrafts pushing it below the minimum safe altitude, the crew had minimal horizontal airspace to execute a corrective maneuver before intersecting the rising terrain. The fundamental physics of heavy aircraft operating near their performance ceilings left no margin for error. When the B-24J failed to arrive at its destination in India, search coordinators faced a massive informational void. With no radar coverage and no telemetry, planners could only sketch search boxes from estimated times and assumed headings. The grid ballooned into thousands of square miles of jungle canopy and sheer rock, an area too vast to sweep safely. By 1947, commanders judged that sending ground teams into uncharted ravines without a confirmed debris field would only add more names to the missing. The ground search was halted to prevent further loss of life among the recovery teams. Mountain geometry erased line of sight, and the jungle canopy swallowed shattered metal before aerial crews could spot it. The bomber's last known heading and its true resting place diverged into an evidentiary blackout, leaving investigators with nothing to work from. The aircraft simply ceased to exist on operational tracking boards. This unbroken silence would persist for more than 6 decades. Across that silence, the aircraft's final mechanical state, the sequence of its loss, and the crew's location stayed unknown. The geographic perimeter remained unbroken without yielding a single structural clue. Localized atmospheric phenomena could turn that routine logistical corridor into a fatal trap. 5 heavily equipped aircraft lost in a single day. During the Second World War, official Air Transport Command records accounted for over 500 crashes along the Hump route, and broader retelling sometimes placed the total higher. The mathematical probability of structural loss was a known operational parameter accepted by military command. On the morning of January 25, 1944, the B-24J formation encountered a severe meteorological front. The tactical environment instantly shifted from visual flight rules to complete instrument reliance. Heavy cloud and fog drove visibility toward near zero, forcing crews onto instruments and stripping away reliable visual reference. The primary hazard was dense frontal weather that rapidly saturated the flight path. 4 other aircraft were also lost during the same approach to Chabua that day, underscoring how quickly conditions deteriorated along the corridor. The flight crews were trapped in a blind corridor with no radar vectoring to guide them around the localized storm cells. The dense cloud cover likely masked sharp temperature swings and violent mountain weather. Contemporary records for this flight do not lock in a single mechanical cause. But along the hump, turbulence, downdrafts, and airframe icing could converge fast, forcing crews fully onto instruments as performance began to slip. To stay airborne in sustained downdrafts and headwinds, the engines could be forced into higher-than-planned power settings, draining reserves faster than the mission profile assumed. Whether the decisive trigger was weather, navigation, or performance limits, the final loss mechanics were still dictated by gravity and the extreme incline of the mountainside. The unpowered airframe struck a steep, densely forested ravine at high speed. High-velocity terrain strikes involving multi-engine bombers typically leave a massive thermal signature. Ruptured fuel lines can spray combustible liquid onto hot engine manifolds and severed electrical cables, feeding a sustained burn that consumes thin aluminum into molten residue. But here, the debris field showed little evidence of a prolonged post-crash fire, whether from low remaining fuel, wet terrain, rapid burial, or some combination. That absence of sustained fire became the procedural clue, and it meant portions of aluminum could survive beneath the jungle canopy. The impact shattered the fuselage, scattering torn aluminum and heavy engine blocks across the vertical scree slope, but it preserved the unburned metal under the jungle canopy. If the aircraft hit the mountain without burning, how much of the airframe survived the kinetic energy of a high-altitude terrain strike? For decades, the official military ledgers recorded the B-24J as permanently unrecoverable, relying on the immense scale of the uncharted terrain to justify a closed case. This institutional assumption was definitively contradicted on December 7, 2006. A civilian researcher named Clayton Kuhles, operating outside official Defense Department channels, recognized the limits of archival search methods. Acting on ground-level accounts from local hunters who had navigated the remote ridges, Kuhles executed a targeted trek into the Upper Siang district of Arunachal Pradesh. The search methodology shifted from blind aerial grid patterns to localized, intelligence-driven ground navigation. By trusting the environmental knowledge of local guides over incomplete historical flight maps, the civilian team breached the geographic perimeter that had hidden the wreck. They reached the high-altitude ravine on foot, doing what official searches could not in the 1940s. Upon reaching the suspected debris field, the immediate investigative priority was establishing a strict chain of identity. A visual confirmation of scattered metal is operationally useless without undeniable proof linking the debris to a specific missing airframe. Because the aircraft had exhausted its fuel and avoided a thermal destruction event, intact sections of the outer structural skin remained preserved beneath decades of jungle overgrowth, and the civilian team systematically surveyed the surface debris until they located a crucial piece of forensic evidence resting in the brush. It was an aluminum panel carrying a stenciled construction number, 2878. That single artifact anchored the debris to serial 4273308, hot as hell, turning scattered metal into a verified forensic site. With a site credibly correlated to a missing aircraft, the objective shifts from search toward survey and, when permitted, recovery. But that shift is never automatic. Access, host nation authorization, and safety constraints set the true tempo. However, the precise geographic coordinates of the confirmed debris field immediately triggered a severe, non-physical operational constraint. The crash bomber was located deep within Arunachal Pradesh. This specific province represents a highly sensitive, heavily militarized border region subject to intense, ongoing territorial disputes between India and China. The location of the wreck triggered a geopolitical access block, a hard diplomatic barrier to any foreign recovery presence. Although the Defense Department now possessed the exact coordinates of the missing crew, it could not unilaterally dispatch active duty military recovery teams or civilian defense contractors into a contested sovereign zone. The physical and logistical capability to mount a heavy expedition was completely neutralized by rigid legal boundaries. Sending uniformed logistics experts or government anthropologists into this specific tactical region required complex, high-level bilateral clearances. The wreckage and the crew were physically stabilized by the cold, the high-altitude environment, but all forensic operations were legally frozen by international border protocols. The military was forced to wait for diplomats to negotiate a narrow legal corridor for a localized archaeological mission. This rigid boundary of international diplomacy created a massive operational pause that stretched across multiple years. The verified wreckage remained isolated on the mountain, entirely exposed to the kinetic hazards of the environment, while bureaucratic negotiations proceeded in distant capital cities. Access issues and security concerns, compounded by punishing mountain weather, kept recovery operations from resuming after the 2009 attempts until late 2015. The physical mountain continued its slow geological degradation of the aluminum evidence, while administrative gridlock prevented any protective intervention by the military. When diplomatic clearance was finally granted, how does a modern forensic team execute an extraction on a terrain geometry that actively sheds boulders? The operational time window to reach and excavate the isolated wreckage was dictated by an arduous physical approach. On October 2, 2015, the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency began its deployment to the Upper Siang District with a 10-mile hike through treacherous terrain, climbing nearly 10,000 feet to establish base camp. The institutional objective was absolute evidence retrieval, but the logistical reality dictated that every single piece of excavation equipment, survival gear, and sustenance had to be carried on the backs of the recovery personnel through dense jungle trails. The specialized unit consisted of a 13-member team of military and civilian recovery specialists. Their explicit mandate was to execute a forensic excavation on a highly treacherous incline. The localized target debris field was situated at a precise geographic elevation of approximately 9,400 feet. Operating at this specific altitude forced the human body to process significantly less oxygen, which immediately degrades physical stamina and slows cognitive processing speed during complex technical tasks. Furthermore, the crash site was not resting on a flat, stable plateau. The shattered aluminum wreckage was distributed across steep slopes ranging from roughly 30 to 60 degrees. This specific geological feature consists of a highly unstable face of loose rock, dense topsoil, and jungle vegetation that naturally rests near its maximum angle of repose. Any localized disturbance to the surface layer immediately threatens to dislodge heavy material from above. To recover microscopic human remains and identifying material from this hostile environment, the unit had to employ a rigorous, heavily modified method of high-altitude archaeology. This operational process requires the manual excavation and meticulous sifting of soil on extreme inclines, demanding specialized safety protocols. Standard forensic archaeological digs rely on flat geometric grid systems, perfectly squared perimeters, and stable vertical trenches to accurately map the exact spatial location of recovered artifacts. On a nearly vertical scree field, that standard methodology is physically impossible. The team had to establish specialized, load-bearing anchor points driven deep into the few stable structures available. They secured themselves and their heavy equipment with climbing ropes simply to prevent a fatal, unarrested fall down the ravine while they worked. Every square inch of the required search grid was covered in thick mountain moss and deeply tangled tree roots that had grown directly through the buried aluminum structure. This organic layer had to be deliberately cut away, section by section, and highly controlled to avoid triggering a localized collapse. Hand tools were utilized to extract the earth, which was then carefully loaded and transported in handheld buckets to a dedicated, artificially leveled screening area. The forensic evidence chain demanded that nothing could be discarded without first passing through a fine wire mesh. The team manually forced the wet, heavy soil through the screens to visually isolate highly degraded bone fragments and microscopic equipment artifacts from the surrounding natural rock and shattered aircraft shrapnel. The physical handling constraints of this environment dictated a severely reduced pace of daily operation. The team had to constantly balance the absolute need for meticulous evidence collection against the continuous threat of kinetic terrain shift. Because the scree slope fundamentally lacked a stable bedrock foundation beneath the wreckage, the mere act of multiple personnel walking across the site altered the load-bearing dynamics of the loose rocks positioned directly above the designated dig zone. The crew was forced to continuously monitor the upper ridgeline for any shedding boulders or sudden soil collapse that could be triggered simply by their own downstream excavation efforts. Despite facing these severe physiological and physical limitations, the methodical screening process continued. The exhaustive forensic operation lasted exactly 35 days on the side of the mountain. Every single shift involved moving massive volumes of earth entirely by hand while continuously anchored to safety lines. At what point does the mathematical probability of finding degraded evidence get overridden by the immediate physical risk to the living? The fundamental assumption of standard forensic recovery is that the crash site represents a static perimeter. However, if the exact opposite was true for the resting place of this specific heavy bomber. The investigative unit was operating within a dynamic wreck environment. In practical terms, precipitation and gravity never stopped working this slope. Debris shifted, and boulders could break loose above the grid. The wreckage sat inside that slow collapse, not outside it. This continuous kinetic landslide hazard dictated every movement the team made while performing high-altitude archaeology. The anchors and safety lines could prevent a technician from falling off the mountain, but they offered no protective barrier against mass cascading from above. The inherent danger of this geological reality materialized violently during the extraction phase. Without warning, the upper ridgeline suffered a localized structural failure. The static friction holding a massive section of scree finally gave way, releasing dense rock and heavy debris directly into the operational perimeter. A sudden slope failure sent rock and debris downslope into the work area, forcing the team to scramble for safety. With close calls mounting, runaway boulders, injuries, and at least one landslide near miss, leaders judged the risk too high to continue digging. After weeks on the mountainside, the mission ended for safety, leaving parts of the wreck environment untouched and turning the chain of custody toward whatever evidence had already been secured. The final operational ledger for the B-24J recovery mission is defined by a stark numerical contrast between the scale of the effort and the volume of the physical yield. Thousands of man-hours, immense logistical planning, and extreme physical risk yielded a highly localized biological return. The extraction teams had manually processed vast volumes of soil under severe constraints before the active environment forced their immediate withdrawal. With the physical extraction phase permanently halted, the chain of custody transitioned from the rugged terrain of the Himalayan scree slope directly into the highly controlled, sterile environment of a Defense Department skeletal identification laboratory. In the laboratory, the case narrowed to DNA baseline matching against family reference samples. Technicians attempted to recover the most durable sequences, mitochondrial or Y chromosome DNA, from heavily compromised mineralized bone. The fundamental physical constraint in this laboratory environment is contamination control and sample viability. The biological structure of the bone acts as a protective calcium vault, but environmental moisture and acidic soil can penetrate and break down the internal genetic chains over time. The laboratory technicians must first mechanically clean the exterior of the fragment, then chemically dissolve a microscopic portion of the bone to release whatever intact genetic sequences remain trapped inside. Once a viable, uncontaminated sequence is successfully isolated and amplified, it must be systematically cross-referenced against a predetermined genetic baseline. This baseline database is built exclusively from DNA provided by the living relatives of the 8 missing crew members who were documented on the 1944 flight manifest. A positive identification is reached when genetic results are consistent with family reference samples and are supported by additional lines of evidence, laboratory analysis, dental and anthropological comparisons, and the broader circumstantial context of the case. The laboratory process was slow and highly demanding due to the heavily compromised, degraded nature of the Himalayan samples. Despite the severe environmental damage inflicted upon the fragments, the chemical extraction protocol was successful. The isolated genetic sequence pulled from the 2 small bone fragments yielded a definitive, measurable biological result. Exactly 1 crew member was positively identified from the mountain debris. The DNA results, supported by laboratory and circumstantial evidence, led to the positive identification of First Lieutenant Robert E. Oxford, one of the aircraft's crew. Following this conclusive laboratory result, a legal declaration of positive identification was formally issued. This procedural action permanently closed his specific personnel file more than 70 years after the aircraft failed to arrive at its destination in India. This single successful identification represents a partial success for the overall recovery mandate. While the undeniable forensic proof of identity validates the immense logistical effort and extreme risk required to reach the isolated debris field, It simultaneously highlights the permanent, unyielding constraints of the environment. The hazards of the slope and the realities of access mean future recovery work is uncertain and dependent on permission, conditions, and an updated risk assessment. As of the June 2017 DPAA announcement, Oxford remained the sole confirmed identification. The rest of the crew were still listed as unaccounted for. The surviving aluminum structure of the heavy bomber, along with the remaining crew, will stay fully integrated into the high-altitude terrain, bound indefinitely by the insurmountable physical constraints of the mountain.